Welcome, and for this video we are going to do a quick and brief overview of decolonization in various parts of the world. Now, with decolonization, it's important to note that it is going to begin very much so as a result of World War II and the end of that particular war. Now, in the lead up to World War II, there had been many nationalist groups that had been fighting against their colonial oppressors, and in addition to that, many of them also fought over the course of World War II and had proved their worth as good citizens, but also that they deserve to have their freedom. And in that way, we can also see that the idea of the white man's burden had pretty fully been stripped away. The picture I have up here is of the cartoon, The White Man's Burden. And with this particular political cartoon, we had seen it previously when we looked at colonization. But here, what you can see is, again, this idea that they're bringing these civilizations away from vice, brutality, slavery, famine, war. And in reality, for Europeans, they've lost that sense of moral authority. Many do no longer feel this self-assurance about their fitness to rule over foreign peoples. And in addition to that, they're doing a very poor job of it. For example, in India after World War II, there's going to be almost immediately a great famine. And for Winston Churchill, he does absolutely nothing to really help with the famine. And in fact, even makes comments to the public about the fact that there's too many people in India anyway. And with that, many around the world, even within the nations themselves, they start to question whether or not they should be practicing these sort of imperial measures in other nations if they cannot actually care for them or provide for them. And so with that, it's also, of course, going to be part of this Atlantic Charter. Now, with the Atlantic Charter, this is also passed after World War II, and it really puts forward the idea that there is a right of self-determination for all peoples and nations. There is a charter that is going to be very important towards the formation of the UN, and basically it says that there are 8 basic freedoms that all peoples and nations should have, and the right of self-determination is a cornerstone of not only the Atlantic Charter, but the idea of the United Nations Charter. And so because of this, we will see Western nations will start to release their colonies between 1846 and 1946 and 1974. With this, I have a map up here that shows the decolonization of Asia. With this decolonization, the parts that are in orange are going to be places decolonized before 1950, and the ones in purple are going to be between 1950 and 1959, and of course moving from there. One instance where decolonization happens relatively quickly and effectively is going to be with the Philippines. For the Japanese, it only for the Philippines, the United States is going to help them to form their own government, and then they leave. They grant them independence on July 4th, 1946, and this is supposed to be a good example, according to President Truman, of what decolonization should be. There is also going to be an idea of preferential trade for finished goods from the United States and raw materials from the Philippines, but again, this was the idea of what it should have been. Now let's talk a little bit more about what happens with India. So as far as India and their colonization, you can think back to that. But as far as Indian colonization before they were colonized, it was made up of multiple different ethnic groups and religious groups. So because of this, in the sort of uniting of all of these groups of people under the British, there were, of course, tensions. But one thing that they wanted to do for sure was to, quote unquote, quit India. They wanted the British to lose money here. They wanted to hurt the British in order to get them out. And one way they did that again is going to be in 1942 with their Quit India campaign. We can see that over the course of World War II as well, roughly 700,000 Indians are going to fight in the war. And you will have the formation of things like the Indian National Congress as well as the Muslim League that are really helping over the course of the war. And so, as far as what happens in India, we will see that India is going to be divided. As it is divided, it is going to be led by educated minorities. Probably the most well-known is going to be Mahatma Gandhi. And with this, for India, as they push for their independence, they are going to use systems of nonviolence. With these nonviolent protests, they do things like Gandhi's Salt March, where they are literally marching to the seas to get salt for themselves as opposed to purchasing it from the British. And with India, as they start to do this, we can see that the British Empire is going to divide India into two separate parts. The first part is going to be India, which is going to be part of the Hindu population, and then they will also have Pakistan, which is going to be where the Muslim people should be. Now, the issue with this is that as they do divide India up and give it its independence, there are people living in both sides that are going to have to migrate to the other nation. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of death. Apparently, it was a very dangerous road to travel. And of course, there were many people who were killed in the process. There was a lot of violence there as well. The next instance we're going to talk about with the British is going to come with Kenyan independence. For the Kenyan people, they wanted their independence except for those who were British citizens. Now, the British citizens did not want independence. Instead, they wanted to remain part of the British Empire. And so because of this, there were a lot of British citizens who lived there, and the British government, they were willing to keep Kenya as a colony for a relatively extended period of time. Now, as far as Kenya, they were going to have a rebellion. It's known as the Mau Mau Rebellion. And during this rebellion, what happens is that many people, they start to fight against the British, and they're trying to regain their territory for themselves. As they are doing so, as this is taking place, the British decide to create concentration camps. With these concentration camps, we will see that there are going to be around 300,000 people who are going to be forced to move. The British numbers say it might have been closer to around 80,000, but those records are relatively incomplete and do not tell the full story of what took place. In these internment camps, you can actually read a lot of their stories online, but there was a lot of brutality that was taken out against these people. Effectively, what they were trying to do was to get everyday citizens to confess to knowing certain people who were part of the Mau Mau, who were part of the rebellion. And it's kind of like today, if there was to be some sort of an uprising, if the government just rounded up as many people as they could and then tried to get people to tell on each other. You might know someone who was part of it, but for a lot of people, they didn't know anybody. And so they would torture them into trying to confess or trying to tell on people, even when there was no way for them to tell. There are a lot of stories about the different types of mutilation that people faced, a lot of the different ways that they were literally beaten to death, tortured to death. And those who did survive had long-lasting impacts. So some examples are, quote, slicing off ears, boring holes in eardrums, flogging until death, pouring paraffin over subjects who were then set on fire, and then burning their eardrums with cigarettes. So again, a lot of torture took place in these concentration camps. Now with this, as far as what happens, eventually Kenya will be granted its independence by the British. However, it is not until 2013 that a lot of this starts to come to light, and a lot of it is because those who survived actually sued the British for their, pain and for the different types of torture that they and their families endured. And so they ended up, the British government apologized and gave out around $20 million in damages to the living survivors, but there were so many living survivors that only ended up averaging out to about $4,000 per person. So with that, we can see that there are many other instances of independence as well. And of course, you are going to learn more about those in your readings and other videos for the week. But those are just two instances of this. And of course, talking a little bit more about some of the main causes of this decolonization.